Ugh, the 80s. Gag me with a spoon. Psych! Like, the 80s were totally awesome. No duh, it was like the baddest time ever. It's like so bogus that so many of you missed out on this rad time. But dude, like for some of us, this will be a righteous trip down memory lane. I could totally talk about the 80s for days, but you are probably totally thinking, barf me out. But take a chill pill because the 80s had the most righteous music, the most tubular movies, and the baddest fashion ever.
That was a Valley girl. And in the 1980s, she was all that. But like she said, the 1980s was the best decade ever because of the music, the movies, and the totally rad fashion. Music was a driving force that shaped the culture in the 1980s. I remember spending many Sunday nights making a mixtape to Casey Kasem's Top 40 Countdown. August 1st, 1981 was a date that changed music history forever. This was the date that MTV was born. History.com commemorated this moment and reported that the Bugles' Video Killed the Radio Star was the first music video to air on the cable television channel. Hooksandharmony.com lists the 5 most influential artists of the 1980s. They include U2, REM, Michael Jackson, Run DMC, and Guns N' Roses. I think this list says a lot about the decade because it is such a diverse genre of music. And we absolutely can't talk about music in the 1980s without giving a little credit to the king of pop. Even though the end of his life was a little bit of a train wreck, I hope that all of you have gotten to experience the 1980s Michael Jackson. Amazon.com reports that Michael Jackson revolutionized all aspects of mainstream pop culture, from radio airwaves to the newly emerging art form of music videos, becoming the world's most popular entertainer in the process. The original Thriller spent an astounding 80 consecutive weeks in the American Top 10, 37 of those at number 1. Thriller made history as the first and only record to be America's top-selling album for 2 years running in 1983 and 1984. Music wasn't the only thing that shaped the 80s. The movies made during that decade drastically impacted the culture, and that for decades to come. Charlie Jane Anders' titled 10 Forgotten Secrets of Great Movie Making from the 1980s says that everybody wants to recapture the glory days of 80s in movies these days. In her article, she points out some of my favorite things from movies in the 80s. These movies took time to establish characters and develop strong sense of camaraderie between them. Even though the build-up is slower, in the end you are deeply invested in the characters and you actually care about what happens to them in the end. Plus, as Ms. Anders points out, the theme songs are awesome. To come up with a list of top 80s movies is almost impossible. It's pretty controversial, and it's probably because there's so many to choose from. I thought I would put together for you my top 10 movies, but that turned into 15, and then that turned into 18. So, how many of these 18 movies have you seen? Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Top Gun, The Breakfast Club, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, The Terminator, The Goonies, The Empire Strikes Back, Footloose, National Lampoon's Vacation, The Karate Kid, The Princess Bride, Dirty Dancing, Can't Buy Me Love, and you can't forget When Harry Met Sally. The fashion in the 80s was as memorable and culture-changing as the music and the movies. It was over the top. Bright, bold, and absolutely excessive. As TotallyEighties.com says, we didn't accessorize, we accessorized, and loved it. They then go on to explain that the clothes worn in the 80s depicted people who were trying to find themselves. They looked for ways to express their creativity and individuality. Men wore heavy makeup and grew long hair, while women wore short hair and layers of clothing. Both sexes were looking for an identity. So here are some examples of 80s fashion. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We've got neon, leg warmers because our legs were so cold, mini skirts, followed by stirrup pants, which you usually wore mini skirts with stirrup pants, acid wash jeans that were usually pegged or rolled really tight at the ankle, parachute pants that started skinny and got really big, shoulder pads, and the biggies, members only jackets, big jewelry and loud makeup, and of course, big hair, even for the boys. So you could probably totally see why the 80s is totally awesome. I mean, it's the best decade ever because of their righteous music, their tubular movies, and their bad fashion. And bad totally means good.